This is my true story. I raised my son with my own hands, fed him, clothed him, gave him a roof. I believed my old age would be safe under his care. But instead, he gave me cruelty. One night, he shoved me into a bathroom, locked the door, and left me trapped for hours. I sat on the cold floor, weak and humiliated, listening to his laughter from the other side. He thought I was powerless, but he forgot the house was still mine. What I did next will shock you. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe so my story reaches more people. I did not grow up with comfort. I was not born into money, and I never had someone to hand me the easy road. Every dollar I ever earned came from sweat, from broken backs, from long days when the sun was too hot, and nights when the cold cut into my bones. I worked in fields, in factories, and on construction sites. I woke before dawn, and I often returned home after midnight. There were days when my body screamed for rest, but I pushed forward because I had a reason: my son. Every sacrifice I made with him in mind. Every pain I endured so he would never have to. When he was a child, I promised myself he would not live the life I did. He would not go to bed hungry, he would not walk barefoot to school, and he would not feel the shame of poverty. I took extra shifts, worked double hours, and saved every cent. While other men spent their wages on drink or gambling, I tucked mine away for his future. I wanted him to study, to have books in his hands instead of tools. I wanted him to wear shoes that fit, clothes without patches, to walk proudly into classrooms and know his father gave him every chance. I bought him his first bicycle, even when I had to skip meals for weeks to afford it. I still remember his smile, the way his eyes lit up as he rode down the street, his laughter filling the air. That was enough for me. That smile erased my hunger, my tired body, my empty pockets. I gave him toys I never had, birthdays I never celebrated, and gifts I could not afford but still bought. To him, it was just childhood joy. To me, it was proof that my sacrifice was working. When he grew older, I paid for his education. While I wore the same worn-out coat year after year, he walked in crisp uniforms. While I fixed my old shoes with tape and glue, he wore new ones every season. I made sure he had books, tutors when he needed them, and the chance to dream. When he wanted a car, I gave him one, even though it meant pulling from the savings I had built for my own retirement. When he fell into debt, I paid it off. When he lost his way, I gave him a second chance. I gave him the family home. Not just the walls and bricks, but the history, the memories, the sweat that built it. That house was my life's work, the place I hoped would keep us together forever. I told myself, he will never know the fear of not having a roof. Every paycheck, every hour of work, every moment I pushed through exhaustion was to make sure he always had safety, security, and a future brighter than mine. And through all those years, I never once asked him for more than respect. I did not want riches. I did not want luxury. I did not want glory. I only wanted to sit in my old age, look at my son, and know my sacrifice had been worth it. I wanted to be cared for, to be spoken to with kindness, to be remembered not as a burden, but as the man who gave everything. That was all. Respect, gratitude, a little love. But what did I receive? Not respect, not kindness, not love. My reward for decades of sacrifice was insults. My gift for years of labor was cruelty. And the same son I once carried on my shoulders when his legs were too weak to walk, the same boy I fed when I had nothing left for myself, grew into a man who mocked me, cursed me, and finally locked me in a bathroom like an animal. That is the truth of sacrifice. Sometimes it builds comfort for others, but leaves scars on yourself. And yet, even as I sat on the cold tile floor of that locked bathroom, humiliated and trembling, I remembered every scar on my hands, every ache in my bones, every hour I gave for him. And I realized something. I was not weak. I was the foundation. Without me, there would be no house, no education, no car, no wealth. Everything he stood on came from me. And when he chose cruelty, he forgot one thing. What is given can also be taken away. The cruelty did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like cracks in a wall that no one notices until it finally collapses. At first, it was just small words, little remarks that stung, but I brushed aside. When I asked him to help me carry groceries, he sighed loudly, rolled his eyes, and muttered, "You're too old for everything." When I moved too slowly at the dinner table, he tapped his fingers impatiently and said, "Hurry up, old man." These words may seem small, but to me they felt like knives. They cut into the very pride I had carried all my life, the pride of being his father. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was stressed, maybe tired from work. I told myself it was just a phase, that he didn't mean it. I remembered how I used to snap at my own father when I was young, and I tried to forgive him quickly. But the words kept coming. They grew sharper. They grew colder. What once could be brushed away now began to pierce deeper. He started calling me useless. He laughed when my hands trembled, pouring water into a glass. He mocked me when I forgot small things, saying, "Your mind is gone. You're nothing but dead weight now." When I asked him to sit and talk, he brushed me off, glued to his phone, replying, "I don't have time for your stories." The same stories he once begged me to tell when he was a child. The same stories that once put him to sleep at night. Insults turned into commands. He no longer spoke to me as a son speaks to a father. He spoke as if I were a servant. "Do this. Don't touch that. Stay out of my way." If I coughed at night, he shouted from the other room, "Be quiet. I'm trying to sleep." He forgot the nights I stayed awake for him when he was sick, the nights I carried him to doctors, the nights I prayed over his fever. And then came the shame. He began to treat me not just with impatience, but with embarrassment. When guests came over, he asked me to stay in my room. He said, "Don't come out, you'll just ruin the evening." He told his friends I was difficult, that I was a burden. I could hear him through the walls, laughing at me, making jokes at my expense. The same man I built a life for now mocked that very life in front of strangers. I tried to speak to him gently. I reminded him of the sacrifices I had made. I told him, "Son, all I ever wanted was for you to live better than I did." But he only sneered and replied, "Yeah, and now you're in my way. You've done your part. Just sit down and don't bother me." Those words burned deeper than any wound, because they were not just dismissive. They erased everything I had done for him. They reduced decades of sacrifice to nothing more than an inconvenience. And yet, I endured. I stayed silent. I told myself, "He is my son. He will remember. He will change. He will see." I swallowed my pride and accepted the insults, thinking love would return if I just stayed patient. I hoped the boy I raised was still somewhere inside the man standing before me. But with each passing day, the cruelty grew bolder. The words cut sharper. The distance grew wider. It was no longer just impatience or embarrassment. It was contempt. The first signs of cruelty were not loud or violent, but they were steady, and they built the road to what came later. The son I once carried on my shoulders now carried nothing but scorn for me. And though I stayed quiet, deep inside, I began to feel something change. A small seed of realization took root. Perhaps this was not just stress or youth. Perhaps this was who he had truly become. The night it happened began like any other, quiet but heavy with tension. I had learned to move carefully around my son, measuring my words, watching his mood, trying not to ignite the anger that seemed to always simmer just below his skin. But even silence was no protection. That evening, I asked him something simple: to turn down the volume of the television. My head ached, my body was tired, and I wanted only a little peace. But instead of lowering the sound, he turned on me with eyes full of rage. He stood, towering, fists clenched, his voice like thunder. "You don't tell me what to do in my house." Before I could even answer, his hands were on me. He grabbed my frail shoulders, pushed me down the hallway, and I stumbled, barely able to keep my balance. His grip was like iron, fueled not by strength alone, but by cruelty. He dragged me to the bathroom, shoved me inside with one final push that sent me to the cold tile floor, and before I could stand, the door slammed shut. The click of the lock echoed like a final sentence. I reached for the handle, twisted, pulled, but it was sealed from the outside. From the other side of the door, his voice came sharp, mocking. "Stay there, old man. That's where you belong." Then came the sound that broke me. Laughter. His laughter. My own son, the boy I once held when he was sick, the child I once carried on my shoulders when his legs were too weak, now laughed as I sat trapped on a bathroom floor. It was not just cruelty. It was betrayal in its purest form. Hours passed. The air grew colder, the tile harder beneath my bones. My body ached, but worse than that was the weight in my chest. I stared at the faucet dripping into the sink, each drop echoing in the silence like a clock counting down my dignity. Hunger gnawed at me, thirst dried my throat, but humiliation was the sharpest pain of all. I pressed my palm against the door, weakly knocking, calling out, "Please, son. Let me out. Please." But no answer came, only silence. And in that silence, my heart cracked. I thought back to when he was a child. I remembered late nights when storms shook the house, and he would cry, afraid of the thunder. I would carry him in my arms to the bathroom, hold him close, whispering that he was safe, that nothing could hurt him while I was there. I gave him comfort in that very room, the same room where he now caged me like an animal. I had once carried him to protect him from fear. Now he had locked me inside to feed my own. As the hours dragged on, my body grew weaker. My legs stiffened, my back screamed with pain, and still I remained trapped. I wondered if this was where my life would end, not surrounded by family, not in the peace of my own bed, but locked in a bathroom, discarded like garbage by the son I had given everything to. My eyes blurred with tears, my breath shallow, my heart heavy. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing the last of my dignity out of me. But even in that humiliation, even as the night stretched endlessly, something inside me stirred. At first, it was sorrow. Then it turned into fire. I realized that this act was not just cruelty, it was a message. He wanted me to feel powerless, worthless, trapped. But he forgot one thing. The lock on the bathroom might have held me for a few hours, but it could not hold the truth of who still controlled everything outside that door. The deed to the house, the bank accounts, the papers, all of it was still in my name. The man he mocked as a prisoner was still the owner of his entire world. By the time the door finally opened and he let me out, smirking as though it were a joke, I did not shout. I did not fight. I did not curse him. I simply walked out slowly, silently, my eyes downcast. But inside, I was no longer just broken. I was decided. That bathroom had become the place where my humiliation transformed into resolve. And in that silence, I promised myself, he would pay for what he had done. When the lock clicked shut that night, it was not only the door that trapped me, it was my own heart. I sat there on the bathroom floor, my back against the cold wall, my knees pulled close to my chest, and I felt smaller than I ever had in my entire life. The tiles pressed into my bones, unforgiving, and the silence of the room pressed even harder into my spirit. I listened to the sound of the dripping faucet, steady, merciless, each drop like a mocking reminder of the hours passing by. The bathroom light above me flickered once or twice, and I stared at the ceiling, asking myself how I had come to this. A father, once strong, once respected, now reduced to a prisoner in the house he built. The humiliation was not only in being locked away, it was in the memory of who I used to be. I remembered the days when I worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours, lifting heavy loads, breaking my back to make sure my son never had to suffer the way I did. I remembered carrying him to this very bathroom when he was just a boy, half asleep in my arms, his head resting on my shoulder, whispering that he needed me. I had knelt on these same tiles to wash his small hands, to clean his scraped knees, to comfort him when he was sick. The bathroom that was once a place of safety for him had now become a cage for me. That thought was heavier than the locked door itself. I tried to call out softly at first, "Son, please, let me out." But there was no reply, only silence, and perhaps worse than silence, the faint sound of him laughing in another room, his voice muffled through the walls. That laughter cut me like a knife, It told me that this was not an accident, not a mistake, but cruelty by choice. He wanted me to feel trapped. He wanted me to feel worthless. And in that moment, I did. I pressed my hand against the door, the wood cool beneath my palm, and I thought of all the doors I had once opened for him. The door to his classroom on his first day of school. The door to our home after I worked late to provide for him. The door to opportunities I had fought tooth and nail to give him. And now, this door was closed on me, locked by the very hands I once guided through life. The humiliation of it wrapped around my chest like a chain, and I could barely breathe. Hours stretched into what felt like days. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, thirst burned my throat. But those were nothing compared to the emptiness inside me. My pride, my dignity, my sense of worth, all of it seemed stripped away with that single act. I was not just an old man sitting on a bathroom floor. I was a father who had been forgotten, a man discarded by the very son he had built his life around. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, crushing me more than the cold tiles ever could. As I tell you this story, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to my God. And I've seen it with my own eyes. When strength fades, respect disappears. One stumble, one fall, and suddenly they call you weak, a burden. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide for seniors. It's not fitness, it's protection. Just 10 minutes a day to stay steady, stay safe, and keep your independence. Download it now. The link is right below in the description. Tears came, though I tried to stop them. My body shook, not from the chill of the floor, but from the ache in my heart. I had never felt so small, so voiceless, so humiliated. In that silence, my mind screamed with questions. Why? Why did he hate me so much? Why did he treat me like this? Did he not remember the sacrifices? Did he not care about the nights I went hungry so he could eat, the years I wore old clothes so he could have new ones? Did he forget everything? Or did he just not care anymore? But as I sat there, broken and humiliated, something else began to grow inside me. At first, it was just a flicker, a thought I pushed away. But the longer I stayed locked in that room, the stronger it became. That flicker turned into a flame of anger, a flame of resolve. Because while my body was trapped, my mind began to see clearly. My son thought he had stripped me of everything, but he was wrong. He had stripped away only my patience. He had stripped away only the illusion that love could excuse cruelty. What he had left behind was something he could not control: my will. By the time the door finally opened and I stepped out, humiliated but breathing still, I was no longer just a broken old man. I was something sharper. My silence had hardened into a weapon, and though my son smirked at me as if he had won, I knew the truth. He had not won. He had only planted the seed of his own downfall. My son thought that by locking me in the bathroom, he had stripped me of everything. He thought that by shutting a door, by turning a key, by laughing as I sat on the cold floor, he had taken away my dignity, my power, my worth. In his eyes, I was nothing but a weak old man, trembling, voiceless, too fragile to fight back. But what he forgot, what he never understood, was that strength is not always in muscle. Power is not always in the loudest voice. Sometimes power is written in silence, in paper, in ink, in signatures, and all of those were still mine. When I stepped out of that bathroom after hours of humiliation, I looked at the walls of the house, at the furniture, at the life he thought belonged to him. He walked around with the arrogance of ownership, but deep inside, I smiled bitterly. Because I knew the truth. This house, every wall, every nail, every window, was mine. The deed still carried my name. The foundation of his comfort was built on my sacrifice, my labor, my years of toil. He thought he was master under this roof, but legally he was nothing but a guest. A cruel guest who had forgotten whose shelter he lived under. The bank accounts, too, were still tied to me. He spent freely, confident that the money would never run dry, never realizing that the streams of wealth flowed because of me. Every cent in those accounts existed because I had worked, saved, invested. His job, his efforts, were drops in a river I had built over decades. He had grown blind to this truth, blind to the reality that the man he mocked as worthless still controlled the keys to every door in his life. I thought back to the papers locked away in my drawer. Deeds, contracts, bank statements. Each one was a quiet reminder that he had built his arrogance on a foundation that did not belong to him. He thought a bathroom lock could cage me, but the real lock, the real control, was still in my hands. He had forgotten that. He had forgotten that the father he called weak was the very reason he had a house to call home, a bed to sleep in, food to eat, money to spend. I sat in silence, and I remembered the years I had worked with nothing but my bare hands. I remembered the heavy beams, the endless shifts, the pain in my back, the blisters on my palms. I remembered the sacrifices I made to give him a life of comfort. And I thought of how easily he had tried to erase it all with a locked door. But what he forgot was simple. What is given can always be taken back. He thought I was powerless because I did not shout, because I did not fight, because I did not strike him with the anger he deserved. But my silence was not weakness. It was strategy. While he laughed at me, I was remembering every signature that still held power. While he mocked me, I was already thinking of the papers that could end his comfort. While he believed I was a prisoner, I was already free in my mind because I knew the truth. The truth was that he depended on me far more than I depended on him. Without me, there was no house. Without me, there was no money. Without me, there was no security. And the moment I chose to act, his world would collapse faster than he could imagine. That was the power he forgot. That was the mistake of arrogance. He believed cruelty was strength, but cruelty is only noise. True strength sits quietly, waiting, watching, ready to strike when the time is right. And in that moment, I realized something even deeper. By locking me in that bathroom, he had not taken away my power. He had given me reason to use it. Before, I had endured his insults, his coldness, his contempt, with patience. I had told myself he would change, that love would return, that respect would come back. But the bathroom ended that illusion. That lock freed me from hope, and in its place, it gave me clarity. I saw everything clearly now. He would never change. But I could. And with the power still in my hands, I would. He forgot that the man he mocked, the man he humiliated, the man he locked away, was still his father. And fathers are not powerless. Fathers are the foundation. And I was about to show him that when you try to erase the hands that built your world, you risk losing the world itself. That night, when I finally lay in my bed, my body still weak from the hours inside that locked bathroom, I stared at the ceiling and felt something break inside me. But it was not the kind of break that leaves you ruined. It was the kind of break that clears the fog, that removes every last piece of illusion, that shows you the truth so clearly it almost hurts your eyes. For years, I had told myself stories. I had told myself my son was only tired, that his anger was temporary, that his coldness was stress, that deep inside he still had love for me. Every insult I swallowed. Every cruel word I buried. Every humiliation I forgave. I told myself that was what fathers do. They forgive. They endure. They carry the weight because they once carried their children. But that night, I could not lie to myself anymore. The lock on that bathroom door was also a lock on my heart, and when it opened, the last piece of hope fell away. I decided something in that moment. I would not live like this again. I would not breathe the same air as a man who could trap his own father like an animal. I would not sit quietly while the world thought I was safe under his roof when, in truth, I was a prisoner inside it. My decision was sharp, clean, and final. I would take back everything he thought was his. I would strip him of the comfort I had built with my own hands. And I would do it silently, legally, without anger, without shouting, without another wasted word. He had chosen to humiliate me. I would choose to erase him. I remember sitting up in my bed, my body aching, but my mind suddenly stronger than it had been in years. I looked at the keys on my table, keys to the house, keys to the car, keys to the drawer where I kept the documents. I touched them one by one, And in that moment, I understood they were not just metal. They were power. They were choices. They were weapons sharper than any knife. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control. My decision had been made, and nothing could change it now. I thought back to all the times I had helped him. When he was in school and couldn't pay tuition, I worked extra hours, and the money came from me. When he wanted his first car, I emptied my savings and handed him the keys with pride. When he faced debts, I sold land that I had kept for emergencies, just to see him free from burden. And now, here he was, locking me in a bathroom, laughing at my weakness. My decision was not born from anger alone. It was born from memory. It was born from the knowledge that I had given him everything, and he had given me nothing but pain in return. So I planned quietly in my mind. I thought of the documents still under my control, the house deed still in my name, the accounts still tied to me. I thought of the lawyer who had once told me, "You are still the owner. You still have every right." Those words echoed in my mind, and I smiled faintly in the dark. My son believed he had trapped me. In truth, he had set me free. He had freed me from loyalty. He had freed me from excuses. He had freed me from the lies I told myself to protect him. And now, I would protect myself. The decision was more than revenge. It was survival. If I stayed, he would destroy me slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. But if I left, I would live again. I would breathe again. I would walk into the rest of my life with dignity. So I decided I would not just leave. I would leave him empty, exposed, broken by the very same arrogance that made him lock me in that bathroom. He thought I was powerless. He would learn I was not. As I drifted into sleep that night, I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, everything changes." And I meant it, because my decision was final. My son would wake up in the same house, thinking nothing had shifted. But in truth, the ground beneath his feet was already gone. The morning after my decision, I woke up with a strength I had not felt in years. My bones were still stiff, my body still weak, but my spirit was alive, sharper than the air I breathed. The sun shone through the curtains, and for the first time, I didn't feel trapped by its light. I felt guided. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, and I knew today was the day I would take everything back. No shouting, no fighting, just quiet action that could never be undone. I moved carefully, gathering what I needed: the keys, the documents, the folder where I had stored the original house deed, all tucked away in a drawer that my son never bothered to check because he thought old men were too weak to matter. I smiled as I pulled it out, running my fingers over the papers. This was not just paper. This was power. This was proof that while he laughed and mocked, I was still the man who owned the roof above his head. I dressed slowly, putting on the same old coat I had worn for years, the one with frayed sleeves but deep pockets. In one pocket, I slid the documents. In the other, I placed my wallet, holding just enough cash for the bus ride. My son was still asleep, snoring in his room, believing he had won. But I knew the truth. His victory was already gone. I walked out of the house with quiet steps, not to run away, but to reclaim everything he had stolen from me. At the bus stop, I stood with strangers, and none of them knew the storm that lived inside me. They saw an old man with a wrinkled face and tired eyes, but inside, I was fire. Every turn of the bus wheels brought me closer to freedom, closer to justice. When I reached the city, I walked straight into my lawyer's office. The receptionist looked at me kindly, and I told her my name. Within minutes, I was sitting across from the man who had once told me I still held every right. I laid the documents on his desk. My voice was calm, steady, and final. "I want to sell the house," I said. He looked at me, surprised, but he didn't question me. He knew. He had seen the bruises on my neck last time, heard the weakness in my voice. Now he saw the resolve in my eyes. He nodded slowly, then picked up the phone. Within hours, the process began. Calls were made, papers prepared, signatures collected. My son's home, the one he thought he ruled, was now nothing more than property waiting to change hands. As I signed each paper, I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders. Every stroke of the pen was a strike against his arrogance. He had locked me in a bathroom, left me in the dark like I was nothing. But here, in this office, with each signature, I was proving I was everything. The house was legally mine to sell, and the law was on my side. He could scream, he could fight, but he could not stop the truth written in ink. By the end of the day, the sale was complete. The lawyer assured me the money would be transferred into accounts under my name alone, secured and safe, untouchable by my son. I sat back in the chair, closed my eyes for a moment, and breathed. For the first time in years, I felt alive. My humiliation had been turned into power, my shame had been turned into justice. My silence had become my greatest weapon. I left the office with my head high, walking through the city streets like a man reborn. The world felt different, lighter, sharper. I wasn't the broken old man my son thought I was. I was the father who had built everything, and now I was the father who had taken it all back. I boarded the bus home, but I didn't go to that house. Not anymore. That house no longer belonged to him, and soon it wouldn't even hold his memories. It would belong to strangers, people who would never know the cruelty that had once lived there. As the bus rolled through the streets, I thought of what would happen next. My son would come home later that night, confident, smug, maybe even drunk, believing his father was still weak and powerless. He would open the door, never knowing that the walls around him were already gone. The house he laughed in, the bathroom he locked me inside, the rooms where he shouted his cruelty, all of it was gone, sold, taken, stripped from his hands forever. The execution of my decision had been swift, clean, and silent. No arguments, no confrontations, just the quiet power of law and ownership. He thought the lock on that bathroom door had trapped me. But in truth, it had freed me. It had pushed me to act, to reclaim everything, to remind him and the world that fathers are not weak, that silence does not mean defeat, that age does not mean powerlessness. When I stepped off the bus, the evening light was falling across the streets, and I felt a strange peace in my heart. I had done it. I had executed my plan without hesitation, and now the future was mine again. My son's world was about to crumble, and he didn't even know it yet. That was the beauty of it. My revenge was not in shouting, not in striking back, but in letting silence and paper destroy him. And tomorrow, when he learned the truth, the echo of that silence would be louder than any scream. The house was already sold, the money already safe, but I knew my work was not finished. My revenge would not only be through property, it had to be through truth, through justice, through making sure the world knew what kind of son he really was. Selling the house took away his comfort, but I wanted to take away the shield he wore in public, the mask of being a decent man. I wanted people to see him for who he truly was, a man who locked his own father in a bathroom and laughed while he suffered. And so, the next step was clear. I had to go to the police. I walked into the police station with slow but steady steps. The air smelled of paper, coffee, and seriousness. I carried with me not just my body, but my bruises, my memories, and the strength that had grown inside me since that night. An officer at the front desk looked up, surprised to see an old man walking in alone. I sat down and told him, in simple words, what had happened. How my own son had shoved me, locked me in a bathroom for hours, and laughed while I sat on the cold floor without food, without water, without dignity. The officer frowned, leaning forward as I spoke. He asked me if I had proof. I nodded and showed him the photographs I had taken of the bruises on my wrists from pounding on the locked door, the marks on my shoulders from when he shoved me inside. I had also written down the date, the time, and even the mocking words he had said through the door. "Stay there, old man," I told them, repeating his cruelty aloud. The words still burned as they left my mouth, but now they were no longer weapons against me. They were evidence against him. The officer called another colleague, and soon 2 of them were listening carefully, taking notes, asking questions. They wanted to know everything: how long I was locked inside, what he said, how I got out, how I felt. I answered every question with patience, with truth, with calmness. My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble. I had been humiliated before, but here I felt strong, because every word I spoke was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. They handed me a form and asked me to sign a formal complaint. I signed it without hesitation. My name, written in my shaky handwriting, was more powerful than any slap or insult he had ever thrown at me. This was no longer a secret hidden between four walls. This was a case, an official report, a record that could not be erased. My son had thought his cruelty would stay locked inside that bathroom. But now it was written in ink, stored in files, and backed by the law. When I finished, the officer leaned back and said, "You did the right thing. This is elder abuse, and we will act on it." His words filled me with a strange relief. For years, I had carried the pain in silence, thinking no one would believe me, thinking no one would care. But now, here were men of law telling me I was not alone, telling me my suffering mattered, telling me my son would be held accountable. They promised they would begin investigating immediately. They would question him, confront him, and if needed, bring charges against him. I nodded, thanked them, and stood up to leave. As I walked out of that station, the evening sky painted in deep orange and purple, I felt lighter. My son had locked me behind a door, thinking the world would never know. But now, the world would know. The police would know. The courts would know. And soon, everyone around him would know. The call to justice was not loud or dramatic. It was not fists, not shouting, not rage. It was steady, simple, and strong. It was me walking into a station with truth in my heart and documents in my hand. It was me refusing to be silent anymore. And it was the law itself standing on my side, ready to strip him not only of comfort, but of the image he hid behind. As I left, I glanced at the people walking down the street, mothers with children, men going home from work, young people laughing together. None of them knew me. None of them knew what I had just done. But I smiled to myself, because I knew. And soon, my son would know too. He thought the bathroom walls would keep his cruelty hidden. But I had opened the door wider than he ever imagined, not into the hallway of our house, but into the eyes of the law. The day the truth reached my son was the day his arrogance finally cracked. He returned to what he still believed was his house, his kingdom, the place where he ruled with cruelty. But instead of comfort, he found strangers. New faces were walking through the rooms, moving boxes, setting furniture in places where his pride once sat. The locks had been changed, the papers had been signed, and the home he mocked me in no longer belonged to him. He pounded on the door, shouting, demanding to be let in, but the strangers only stared back at him with confusion. They told him the truth he had not yet heard. "This house has been sold. It is not yours anymore." The rage that followed was predictable. He screamed, cursed, threw his fists against the door like a child denied a toy. But behind all that noise was panic. He had believed his father was powerless, a man to be shoved into bathrooms and laughed at. Now he realized the man he mocked was the same man who still held the power to erase his comfort with a signature. He stood outside that house, his face red, his voice breaking, while neighbors peeked through curtains and whispered. The son who had once strutted proudly now looked like a fool, banging on a door that no longer recognized him. But that was only the beginning. Hours later, as the sun went down and the night crept in, the sound of sirens filled the street. Police cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue against the walls of the house he no longer owned. Officers stepped out, holding papers, carrying authority, walking with purpose. My son's voice dropped from rage to disbelief as they approached him. They called his name, asked him questions, and then told him what I had done. I had filed the report. I had told the truth. And now, the truth was knocking at his door harder than he had ever knocked at mine. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the flashing lights. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs turned into open talk. "That's the man who locked his father in the bathroom. That's the one the police came for. Can you imagine treating your own father like that?" His reputation, built on pride and lies, collapsed in minutes. He tried to argue with the officers, tried to laugh it off, but the evidence was too strong. My complaint was official. My photographs were real. My words carried the weight of the law, and his arrogance could not stand against it. As the officers questioned him, his body language changed. His shoulders slumped, his hands shook, his voice cracked. He was no longer the man who shouted at me, no longer the man who locked me behind a door, no longer the man who spat cruelty into my ears. He was a cornered liar, a coward exposed, a bully without power. The same neighbors who once believed his charm now looked at him with disgust. Some even turned their backs, unwilling to stand near him. The fallout was not only outside, it was inside him too. I could see it, even from a distance, even though I was no longer there. His arrogance had been built like a tower, but towers fall hardest when their foundations rot. And his foundation had been built on cruelty, on disrespect, on treating the man who gave him life as if he were nothing. Now, the tower fell, and the sound of it echoed across the street, across the neighborhood, across the life he thought he controlled. The officers told him to come with them. At first he resisted, but then the reality sank in. This was no longer about family arguments, no longer about insults shouted inside walls. This was law. This was justice. He was facing the consequences of his choices, and there was no door he could lock to keep it out. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and the neighbors gasped. The same hands that once locked me in a bathroom were now locked themselves, chained by the very law he thought would never touch him. As they placed him in the car, the lights still flashing, I imagined his face. Shock, disbelief, maybe even fear. He had never thought this day would come. He had believed I would always be silent, that I would always forgive, that I would always endure. But he had underestimated me. He had forgotten that silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation. And I had prepared. I had sold the house. I had emptied the comfort. I had spoken to the police. I had turned his cruelty into his downfall. The fallout spread further. His friends stopped calling. His relatives whispered behind his back. The man who once boasted of wealth and control was now the man whose father had taken it all away. He stood exposed, humiliated, alone. And I was nowhere to be found. He could not call me, could not beg me, could not face me. The house was gone. The money was gone. His pride was gone. And in its place, he had nothing but shame and the weight of police records. That night, as he sat in a police station answering questions, I sat quietly in a different place, far away, at peace. I did not need to see his face to know what was happening. I could feel it, like a storm breaking after years of silence. He had thought he was strong. He had thought he had the power. But the fallout of his actions proved otherwise. The world knew now. The law knew now. And most importantly, he knew now. The father he had mocked, locked, and humiliated was the father who had destroyed him without raising a hand. When the dust finally settled, when the shouting ended, when the lights of the police cars faded into the night, I found myself sitting alone, not in sadness, not in weakness, but in peace. For years, I had carried humiliation like a stone tied to my back. For years, I had accepted cruelty in the name of family. But now, that weight was gone. The house was no longer his. The law was no longer blind. And the shame he once poured over me had been poured back over him, tenfold. This was not the kind of justice that comes from fists or anger. This was the justice that comes from truth, from patience, from finally standing up in silence and letting actions speak louder than words. I thought about all the nights I had endured his insults, all the mornings I had forced myself to smile just to keep peace. I thought about the hours in that locked bathroom, the cold tile beneath me, the sound of the faucet dripping, mocking me like a clock. And then I thought about the moment I signed the papers, the moment I walked into the police station, the moment I placed my name on that complaint. Those were the moments that turned pain into power. Those were the moments that changed everything. My son had believed he broke me, but in truth, he had built me into something stronger. He had forged my will in fire, and that fire had burned down the house of arrogance he had built. I was free now, free from his cruelty, free from the walls that once trapped me, free from the fear of speaking the truth. My dignity, once stolen, had been returned. I lived quietly, far from him, far from the neighbors, far from the whispers, but every day I felt the warmth of justice in my chest. I no longer woke up in shame. I woke up in peace. The silence of my mornings was no longer heavy with sadness. It was light, filled with relief. As for him, he was left with nothing. No house, no money, no respect, no shield. People who once stood beside him now avoided his shadow. Friends who once laughed at his jokes now laughed at his downfall. Neighbors who once envied his pride now pitied his disgrace. He was left not just homeless, but hollow. And that was the truest justice of all. Because cruelty has a way of circling back. You can mock a weak man, but if that man holds truth, if that man holds patience, if that man holds the law, then one day the cruelty will return to you. My son learned that lesson the hardest way possible. I often sit quietly, sipping tea, listening to the birds outside, and I remind myself, revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it moves slowly, like ink across paper, like a signature on a deed, like the steady steps of an old man walking into a police station. Sometimes it is not about shouting or striking back. Sometimes it is about removing yourself from cruelty and letting the one who caused it fall under the weight of his own actions. My story is not one of violence. It is one of survival. He thought he locked me in a bathroom, but in truth, he locked himself into his own destruction. He thought I was powerless, but in truth, I was patient. He thought I would always endure, but in truth, I was preparing. And when the time came, I did not need anger. I only needed the law, the papers, and my silence. So I live now with dignity. And he lives with nothing but records, shame, and the memories of the father he once tried to break. But he did not break me. He built me. And I will carry that truth until my last breath. Final thought. He locked me in the bathroom for hours. I sold the house and left him with nothing but police. Before I end, let me tell you, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to God. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide only for you, so you can stay steady, safe, and independent. Download it now. The link is in the description.